If you followed my channel for any length of time, you know that I'm a big fan of video games from the mid to late 90s, because that was a point in time in which there were large leaps in video game technology being made, allowing for deeper, more in-depth, and more technologically advanced games to be made. But it was also before any tropes and standard practices were adopted, leading to a bit of a Wild West scenario where every single game was a weird artistic expression unique to the creator, completely uninfluenced by the gaming landscape surrounding it. But when you go through and focus on a specific point in time, you're no doubt going to come across a number of recurring names from that point in time which no longer exist. But in this case, this is a name that keeps coming up. It's a name that's incredibly prolific in the sense that it was once one of the biggest gaming publishers on the market, and yet despite having a slow and painful decline, and despite facing financial turmoil and certain death on multiple occasions, somehow still persists. And that is none other than Interplay Entertainment. Interplay is one of the most fascinating game developer publishers to my mind, because it should have gone out of business like 6 times over. And yet it somehow persists like a cockroach. So I wanted to take a marginally in-depth look at the history of Interplay, where it came from, where it went, and examine the state of living death that it currently occupies. Interplay as an entity began in 1983. As with most prolific video game publishers and developers, Interplay started as a result of another company shuttering its doors. In this case, it was a developer called Boone Corporation, named after its founder Mike Boone. This was a company that existed for a short period of time and made a grand total of 3 games: Crater Raider, Cyclone, and The Demon's Forge. After which 4 employees of Boone Corporation got together and decided they wanted to break off and make their own software company. These founding members were Brian Fargo, Troy Worrell, Jay Patel, and Rebecca Heineman. Though if you read certain old documents about the company, Rebecca Heineman is referred to as Bill Heineman on account of coming out as a trans woman in 2003. Just to clear up that bit of confusion. 4 people who you don't really hear the names of all that much these days. Brian Fargo is probably the most famous of the lot, but that's besides the point. Their main financial backer was also a guy named Chris Wells, who I can't find any info about. For the first 7 years of their existence, Interplay was a developer and nothing more, but they also were developers that dreamed of the stars. While the company was founded in 1983, it would be well over a year before they released their first game. Before that, they were largely doing contract work, not developing their own software. But eventually, they were able to catch a break. Their first couple of games were relatively unremarkable PC adventure games, made possible by a $100,000 deal that the company made with Activision for 3 separate games, which resulted in Mind Shadow, The Tracer Sanction, and Borrowed Time. It wasn't a ton of startup capital, but it was enough to bide their time until their first breakout hit, The Bard's Tale. Now, I will admit to never having heard of the Bard's Tale trilogy until doing research for this video, but apparently this is a trilogy that was a very big deal for PC gamers back in the 80s. Such a big deal that there was actually a lawsuit between Interplay and EA over who actually owned the IP. Unfortunately, Interplay lost the lawsuit, and apparently not being able to develop new entries in the series inspired them to create a brand new RPG series that we'll be getting to in quite a while. You know, that game that starts with F and rhymes with Callout. The series was such a big deal, as a matter of fact, that the success allowed Interplay only 5 years into its existence to break away from the standard video game developer-publisher model, allowing them to self-publish their own games, beginning with Battle Chess, which was surprisingly somewhat of a big deal for its time. Despite only being chess, they dolled up the presentation with unique animations for when pieces met each other on the board, and this was enough novelty for the game to stand out as more than simply a chess game, resulting in Interplay's first independent hit, the first step in them becoming the company they would eventually become. While they would continue to work with EA and Activision on various titles, they would officially transition out of the standard developer-publisher relationship entirely in 1990. The last game made by Interplay published by another company would be The Adventures of Rad Gravity in 1990, published by Activision, which is quite frankly an incredibly underrated NES game, honestly one of my favorites. The gameplay is smooth and intuitive, and the game is filled with personality on a level you really didn't get much on the NES. The first game that Interplay officially published is not the easiest to nail down. It was one of 2 games. It was either Checkmate by Oxford Studios, or it was certain versions of the game Future Wars by Delphine Software. Which versions, you may ask? Given that Interplay published the North American versions of a couple of Delphine's later games, I would hazard to guess the same applies to Future Wars. But I've buried the lead here a bit, because Delphine Software was somewhat of a big deal to graphic adventure game fans in the 1990s, being responsible for a trilogy of cinematic, or cinematique, graphic adventure games. They're French, you see, you have to pronounce it that way. All three of which were a few of the first games that Interplay published, those games being the aforementioned Future Wars, James Bond The Stealth Affair, which was its North American name. In Europe, they couldn't wrangle the license, so it was simply called Operation Stealth, starring John Glames. Jesus fucking Christ. And the third game in their cinematique trilogy, Cruise for a Corpse. They would also go on to publish a fourth game by Delphine Software, Eric Chahi's Another World, or at least the console version, considered by some to be the greatest cinematic platformer game ever made, though the agreement between Interplay and Delphine ended before they could get their grubby mitts on Flashback, yet another contender for the greatest cinematic platformer ever made, but they also got out before having to publish Shaq Fu, so all's well that ends well. This era sort of represented a shift in the output of Interplay. While they would still make plenty of games in-house, such as the Lord of the Rings games, various Star Trek games, Mario Teaches Typing for some reason, and further sequels to Battle Chess, their output gradually shifted from being a developer into being primarily a publisher. Much like Psygnosis before it, Interplay would help many studios get off the ground that would eventually go on to do big things. Treyarch, Stainless Games, Volition, Infogrames, they were a frequent collaborator of Gremlin Interactive, and probably their most prolific collaborator would be a little company called Silicon and Synapse. Why are they a big deal? Well, the company was co-founded by Alan Adham, who was a former employee of Interplay. He was also a friend of Interplay CEO, the aforementioned Brian Fargo, which would immediately establish a sweetheart deal working relationship between the two. So for a 10% stake in the company, Interplay would contract SNS to port Interplay's games to other platforms. A collaboration which was the starting point in the company getting off the ground and eventually making and publishing their own intellectual property. Eventually, Silicon and Synapse would rename themselves to Blizzard Entertainment. Yeah. So World of Warcraft, Hearthstone, Diablo, Overwatch, these things would not exist if not for Interplay. With that said, however, despite their best efforts, they still hadn't really established themselves as a top-tier publisher in the early to mid-90s. They were still a step below that, mostly because despite developing and publishing a lot of games, they had yet to really make something that could push them to that next level. They had several groundbreaking games as well as cult classics. The most groundbreaking game they were involved with around this time would probably be Alone in the Dark in 1993. The original version came out in 1992, but the North American version, published by Interplay, came out in 1993, just to clarify. The granddaddy of 3D survival horror, but while it was a success, the game's spiritual sequel, Resident Evil, would be the game that ended up being the genre-defining smash hit that set a multi-billion-dollar franchise in motion. While Alone in the Dark was largely left to flounder after the success of the initial game. Then you have the Clay Fighter series, a pretty significant entry into the early tournament fighter genre. And while it wasn't as big or noteworthy as the likes of Mortal Kombat or Street Fighter, it still had its own distinct fan base and dedicated audience to this day. But once again, not enough to push any company involved into the upper echelon of the industry. Going into the mid-90s and the dawn of early 3D, this was their golden age. This was when they were involved in the creation of several of their most well-known titles. The first in this particular era would probably be a game by a little-known studio called Parallax Software called Descent. Descent is one of my favorite game franchises of its era. It's a smooth, action-heavy flight simulator with 6 degrees of movement. A standout in the early days of full 3D flight simulators, one of their early quasi-mainstream hits, and it resulted in a legendary trilogy of games. Of course, Parallax Software would go on to become Volition Software, creating a couple of my favorite games of all time. And Descent was a hit on both PC and consoles. Still not necessarily big enough to push them into that next level, but enough to fund their next run of games. And from this point forward, their catalog was a mixture between awesome heavy hitters and weird obscure games that largely earned cult status. On the weird and obscure side, you have the likes of Normality, developed by Gremlin Interactive, a frankly bizarre dystopian first-person adventure game that starred Corey Feldman for some reason. Or Boogerman, a pick-and-flick adventure, a gross-out 2D platformer based around a superhero that uses the less-than-pleasant bodily functions to attack, which, fun fact, actually had a Kickstarter for a sequel at one point, but the Kickstarter failed. Then you had something like Realms of the Haunting, a legendary first-person shooter horror-adventure hybrid that resulted in one of my favorite Game Dungeon episodes. But on the more awesome side, you have the likes of Carmageddon, an early standout in the combat racing genre, which also resulted in not an unreasonable amount of controversy. Then you had Loaded, also by Gremlin Interactive, and I know Loaded is not the first game you think about when Interplay is mentioned, but it's my personal favorite game they were involved with. A brutal and shamelessly audacious top-down shooter with such an eye-catching aesthetic and presentation. It's one of those games I bought sight unseen, not knowing exactly what it was. I think it was a gift to myself on my, I want to say, 22nd birthday. Oh man, there were some good times with this game. It also had a sequel called Reloaded, which means they were a couple of games that took the same naming principles as those Metallica albums that everyone hates. Given that this was their most prolific era, there are too many individual games for me to go over, so I'm gonna give some love to the heavy hitters and a bit of a speed round. Free Space, Kingpin Life of Crime, Redneck Rampage, Eric Chahi's Heart of Darkness, Warcraft Orcs and Humans, one of the versions of Tempest 2000? Am I forgetting something? I feel like I'm forgetting something that people would get mad at me if I forgot. Oh right, during this time they were bringing in enough money that they were able to expand their operations. First of all, they opened the studio that they would be most famous for, which was Black Isle Studios. This was an in-house subsidiary which they would use as one of their primary development studios, and in particular, they were the developers of the Fallout series. Beginning with the original Fallout in 1997, and with that they also debuted their Planet logo, which emphasized the tagline, by gamers, for gamers, and given that Brian Fargo was still running things by this point, yeah, I could see it. If you know anything about Interplay, chances are it's the fact that they were responsible for Fallout, specifically the first 2 games and a few spin-offs. As a matter of fact, I cannot possibly emphasize enough how big of a deal Fallout was, and by extension their involvement. It was one of the biggest PC games of its day, with gameplay systems so groundbreaking, deep, and beloved by fans that Interplay earned the moniker of the King of Western RPGs. And of course, Fallout remains one of the biggest video game franchises out there right to this day, especially with a successful TV show. One could argue that this was the series that finally pushed them into that upper echelon as being a top-tier name in the gaming industry. But Black Isle Studios also made Planescape Torment as well as the Icewind series. You may be mistaken in thinking that Black Isle Studios made Baldur's Gate, but that's not true. They actually merely published Baldur's Gate. It was actually the result of a collaboration between Black Isle and none other than BioWare in one of their earliest outings. There were other less substantial subsidiaries that were either purchased or formed around this time, such as Digital Mayhem, which only lasted from 2000 to 2002, but made 5 games, including its most notable title, Run Like Hell. Blue Sky Software, which really didn't make anything of note if I'm being honest, Tribal Dreams, which made 1 game and died. So not a lot of heavy hitters, except for what could have been considered their main subsidiary that wasn't an in-house studio, Shiny Entertainment. They were known for a few things, Messiah, Wild 9, and so on. But the thing they were definitely most well known for was Earthworm Jim, an anarchic 2D side-scroller about an earthworm and power armor. From that premise, the games only got weirder. It was also a series of games that was popular enough to spawn a 2-season cartoon show, which was actually really good. Now, of course, outside of publishing a single version of the first game, Interplay had no involvement in the first 2 Earthworm Jim games on account of having purchased Shiny Entertainment after the second one came out. But it was another large IP under their belt, and surprisingly, it's one of the few big properties they never lost the rights to. You know what's funny about Interplay during much of the 90s? Because mundanity is boring, you didn't really hear much about what was going on behind the scenes around this time. I've looked up article after article, webpage after webpage, and everything about Interplay during this time is simply a recap of the games they made. It was business as usual, and business was good. Until it wasn't. Unfortunately, despite having a number of successful intellectual property by this point, by 1998, the company was facing serious financial difficulties. Now, if it seems like this is coming out of nowhere, I agree. Reading into the history of Interplay reads like this: success, 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 we're millions of dollars in debt. It kind of slaps you in the face and really shows you how quickly your fortunes can turn in a tumultuous industry like gaming. Now, why would this be the case? Why would they suddenly be heavily in debt? Well, there are a few reasons that are documented, and one particular reason that I can speculate on. The first issue they faced was significantly increased competition heading towards the new millennium. This was an industry that was gradually becoming bigger and bigger and more profitable, and as such, the legacy companies that couldn't keep up were being left behind. And by this point, Interplay's flops were gradually outnumbering their hits. In particular, their sports division was floundering, and they made a lot of sports games. Between 1995 and 2000, they made 14 sports games, as well as several more licensed racing games, and that doesn't even count the casino games they made, which aren't sports games, but are somewhat in the same vein in the sense that they were only for the enthusiast. But none of these games could keep up with the heavy hitters among the bigger publishers, and even a lot of their other games outside of and sometimes even inside of their crown jewel franchises weren't exactly bringing in the cash. For example, Earthworm Jim 3D was a 3D sequel to a pretty significant franchise, but it's noted as having been a commercial and critical failure. Unrelated fun fact, by the way, I used to have a coworker who was incredibly tall, incredibly thin, and had no chin. His nickname was Earthworm Jim. They were also facing financial issues on account of the fact that most of their big titles around this time were PC exclusive, which was somewhat of a niche market around this time, and consoles were where most of the money was at. So despite being successful in their own bubble, they weren't making the type of money to be able to keep up. They definitely weren't making enough money to be able to spend it at the rate they were. Those are the noted reasons, but I also have a theory. It's said that at its peak, Interplay had over 500 employees after a significant expansion in the early to mid-90s. So if I had to speculate, they rapidly expanded on account of their successes, and much like many companies that rapidly expand, they did so with the understanding that they would incur significant losses at first, but with the further understanding that assuming all went well, it would pay off within a few years. However, we often hear this strategy in relation to successful companies, and in this case, the gamble seemingly didn't pay off, and they overextended, resulting in catastrophic losses due to their overhead being far too great for them to compensate with their current output. And when this happens, the only real hope is to try and retract quickly enough to survive, and as a result, by 1998, Interplay was floundering, and floundering hard. They had to shrink their debt and stem their losses quickly. It was to the point where they had to use multiple methods to avoid bankruptcy. First, they went public on the NASDAQ. That didn't fix things. They entered into some weird agreement with Virgin Interactive to acquire 44% of the company, not Virgin Interactive buying out Interplay the other way around. I don't know how that was supposed to clear their debts, but the result was an exchange agreement where the two companies would handle publishing duties of each other's games in different regions, presumably as a cost-cutting measure based on where the two companies were based. Still, it didn't work. They also entered into an agreement with Vivendi Universal Games in order to give the publishing duties of many of their properties over so that Interplay could focus on the development side. Once again, it didn't work. Also, this resulted in a lawsuit later on, and their final means of getting out of debt was investment and ultimately acquisition. And the company of choice would be none other than Titus Interactive, you know, the company that was responsible for Superman 64. Definitely the company you want investing in you. While they were only a minority owner at first, buying 34% of the company for $10 million, within a few months they had officially invested $45 million into the floundering company for a controlling stake of 57% and eventually 72%, meaning that Titus had officially taken full control over the company and its subsidiaries. As a result, by 2002, Brian Fargo, the longtime CEO, stepped down in favor of Herb Cain, the CEO of Titus, taking over. He managed to stop the bleeding for a time, largely by canceling some projects and selling off some subsidiaries. Most notably Shiny Entertainment, which was sold to Infogrames for $47 million. Though Interplay retained the rights to Earthworm Jim, they also closed down Black Isle Studios, and with that, the original developers of Fallout were gone. But once again, that wasn't enough. It starts to become clear at this point that the company was almost destined for failure. No matter how much they stemmed the tide, they couldn't seem to get ahead of their losses. Their finances were so bad and the company worth so little that it was actually delisted from the NASDAQ at this point, though it may have been relisted at some point because it's on the NASDAQ website, but I'm not sure how that all works. It's penny stock either way. And after a string of console games, which were all over the map critically but were all flops commercially, the company's fate was pretty much sealed when they incurred a $20 million loss during the 2003 fiscal year. Following this, their financial troubles were so vast, they actually faced legal fines from the state of California for various labor violations, including not paying their employees, not paying benefits, medical insurance, or workers' comp. And that's on top of over $100,000 of taxes they had yet to pay. The company effectively ended for the time being when they were evicted from their original Irvine, California offices in 2004. It turns out they apparently owed over $400,000 in rent to their corporate landlord. And that's tragic when you think about it. They were being kicked out of their headquarters that they had worked in for over 20 years. And the financial turmoil that they found themselves in led the company to go inactive for a while. The final game that they released for the time being would be Fallout Brotherhood of Steel in 2004. A game which, unlike previous Fallout games, was developed by Interplay itself, meaning that they were probably hedging their bets on it at the time, but it both reviewed and sold poorly, exacerbating the issues that they were already facing. But as they had already done once before, they were not going to go quietly into that good night, although their financial insolvency would take a few years to deal with, and things would get worse before they would get better. It was announced in June of 2004 that the parent company Titus was declaring bankruptcy, and in early 2005 the bankruptcy was formalized. And in a weird snake eating its own tail type deal, Interplay then purchased its own parent company, which led to Interplay officially being the head honcho of the whole deal, but they also inherited the debt that Titus had around the time, which only made things worse. In an effort to get some quick cash together, they licensed off the Fallout series to Bethesda for just over $1 million. They did not sell the series just yet. Bethesda was merely given free rein to make 3 new games. However, that quick cash they got quickly dried up, and in November of 2006, after well over a year of pretty much nothing of note, the company was issued an involuntary bankruptcy order, otherwise known as the corporate death sentence. But they were able to avoid bankruptcy for the time being by altering the licensing agreement with Bethesda and Fallout. This is when Bethesda officially acquired the rights to Fallout for $5.75 million, and now in sort of an Uno reverse moment, Interplay was then licensed Fallout from Bethesda, because Interplay had been trying to get a Fallout MMO called Fallout Online off the ground for some time. And they were allowed to develop it under several conditions. Interplay had to begin development within 24 months, they had to front the development costs worth a sum of $30 million, development could last no longer than 4 years, and Bethesda would get 12% of the profit. And this was, for all intents and purposes, the dying gasp of Interplay as a viable gaming company. The last chance they had to make a comeback. I imagine it like you're on a highway and you've officially run out of gas, but you're still going forward out of pure momentum. Will you make it to a gas station, or will you end up stranded? That's where Interplay found themselves, and as a result, the race was on to try and find developers, to try and find funding, and to get this sumbitch made. It was referred to as Project V13, a shortening of Vault 13. Along with a few main developers of the original Fallout, Interplay entered into an agreement with a Bulgarian company called Masthead Studios when they offered their services to handle the bulk of development. And an agreement was reached. Interplay even received funding when a company called Interactive Game Group purchased 2 million shares of Interplay for consideration of future game projects. So as the story goes, they had every intention of swinging for the fences, but as we know, Fallout Online never materialized. Even though the game had apparently reached the point of being in full swing development, and was even officially announced to the public in 2010, the issues had already begun. In April of 2009, Bethesda officially rescinded their licensing agreement. Bethesda also filed a lawsuit on account of Interplay selling digital copies of the first 3 Fallout games, even though they may not have had the rights to those games anymore. A lawsuit which ended in 2012 after Bethesda agreed to pay Interplay the sum of $2 million in order to officially give up any claim to the Fallout IP altogether. And despite their best efforts, that was the official end of Interplay's involvement with Fallout, their biggest intellectual property, the property that had helped them out of bankruptcy. But now without it, the company had to make the most out of the time and the money they had left. Following this, they did give it their best shot, possibly, reworking Project V13 into something else. In 2013, Interplay reopened Black Isle Studios for the purposes of working on this new incarnation of Project V13. No longer being connected to Fallout in any way, the game was purported to be a new IP and was also purported to be a strategy RPG in the same vein. And somewhat ahead of its time, Interplay launched a crowdfunding campaign in order to fund a prototype. I can't seem to find any info on how much money the crowdfunding campaign generated. I did read somewhere that apparently the crowdfunding website was on the sketchy side, but I also have no way to verify that for myself. But either way, the contributors forum was launched in January of 2013, but all updates to the game progress halted in January of 2014. And it's believed around this time that, much like a lot of things, the game was quietly cancelled. Some even going as far as to speculate that the game was never being worked on at all. It was also around this time that the company, in no uncertain terms, announced that they were questioning their future as an entity in the gaming industry on account of the harsh competition and their inability to produce. Either way, we'll never know how far along into development the game was or when it officially ceased. And with that major project gone, Interplay found itself scrounging for scraps for a while. During the development of the project, Interplay broke a 6-year drought and started releasing new games. In fact, between 2010 and 2012, they released 10 games. Some of them they published, some of them they developed, and some of them were published under the Interplay Discovery label, which was a separate entity, basically indistinct from the main entity. Not that any of it mattered, none of these games were anything substantial, most of them were iOS slop. The only exception was Stonekeep: Bones of the Ancestors, and I mean, come on. This looks like a fake game. This cover looks like something I would whip up in Photoshop class at the age of 14. Apparently the game sold decently, but looking at it, it doesn't do much to dissuade the fact that it looks like a fake game. But either way, there was at least an attempt during this time, but after Project V13 was quietly cancelled, all news and activity regarding Interplay ceased. The one game that was released after Project V13 went down the tubes was a remake of Battle Chess, which came and went to little fanfare. The car had officially died in the middle of a desert, a long road trip brought to an unceremonious end. And after that, Interplay sort of entered a state of Schrodinger's cat-style existence where they were seemingly both in business and out of business. They haven't released any new games under their own power since 2015. The most recent thing they were even tangentially involved with was Kingpin Reloaded, a remaster of Kingpin Life of Crime. I was actually morbidly curious about this game when it was announced back in January of 2020, mostly on account of the fact that Interplay was credited as a co-publisher. But from what I understand, 3D Realms took over publishing duties, and therefore I'm not sure how involved Interplay actually was with the game's creation. If I had to guess, it was probably just a licensing deal. Either way, it was stuck in development hell for 3 years and was a glitchy mess when it finally released. But they still at least take partial credit for it on their website. Oh boy, their website. That's a story in itself. I remember when I first started looking into Interplay back in the late 2010s, the website was nothing more than a big banner saying coming soon. I was under the assumption that the website, much like many other aspects of the company, was quietly abandoned mid-development, but at some point the website was actually finished. It looks like crap in my opinion, but it is finished. Largely at this point it's just an archive of all the games they were responsible for that they still have the rights to, and links to buy them where you can, if you can. The two most recent things that could have resulted in brand new products had to do with Earthworm Jim. First of all, there was Earthworm Jim 4, which was going to be exclusive to the Intellivision Amico. And oh boy, that's a whole different can of worms in itself. But that was quietly cancelled on account of the console itself being quietly cancelled. I mean, they still insist it's coming, but let's not kid ourselves. Then you have a new Earthworm Jim cartoon, which was also put on hold, but let's be honest, it's probably cancelled as well. And that's really it. Outside of that, they've re-released a whole bunch of their old games on digital platforms, and as a matter of fact, were one of the first publishers to really embrace digital platforms like good old games back in the day, but nothing new has been made since 2015. The fact they still make money on old games is probably the sole reason why they're still in some form of operation. According to their website, they only have 4 listed employees, and Herve Kane has remained the CEO of the company since he took over after Brian Fargo stepped down, but they're still barely in existence. If I had to speculate, I'd imagine their operating revenue probably isn't even in the 7th digit anymore. They probably have very little overhead, but very little substantial profit either. And my fascination with Interplay largely stems from their staying power more so than for anything they made or published. Because in all honesty, I haven't played many games they were involved in. I love me some Descent, and of course I love me some Loaded, but outside of that, I haven't gotten around to playing much of anything they've made, let alone played enough to gain any fondness for them. To me, it's just so fascinating how a company like this can face financial ruin multiple times and completely skirt disaster by restructuring and selling off their intellectual property in the same way a cargo plane might jettison their cargo to stay in the air. Not only that, but the CEO of the company has remained in charge of the company for a quarter of a century, despite the fact that there were multiple instances where he could have sold the company or could have walked away from the company smelling like roses and left it to die. No, dude stuck with it to this very day. And we know he stuck with it at least until the point in which the website went live in the early 2020s. Their influence on the gaming industry has shrunk to almost nothing, and yet they're still there, surviving like a cockroach in the apocalypse, when most companies of their ilk would die without a trace. I'm not even sure if they even have an official headquarters at this point. Google lists a headquarters, but who knows if that's still accurate. And if they do have a headquarters, what would they even be doing right now that requires an office space, given that their income is almost entirely collected from old games that already exist? There's another gaming company I'm sort of interested in for the complete opposite reason of Interplay, called Jalico. They were a fairly decent-sized game developer and publisher in the 80s, probably most famous for City Connection, but as time went on, they couldn't keep up with the rest of the industry and gradually lost their influence until by the time of the new millennium, they were a husk. They were acquired by a company called PCCW, then over the following years, they would be acquired by multiple parent companies that attempted but ultimately failed at restructuring the business into a profitable game developer until they ended up with a company called Game Yaru, which itself went bankrupt in 2014, at which point Jalico as a company, along with all its history, ceased to exist. And that's the baseline of how these things usually go, and yet Interplay survives. And I'm sure one day when the sun finally explodes and takes the Earth with it, there will be 3 things that survive: TNA Wrestling, Twinkies, and Interplay Entertainment. But with that said, whatever happened to the founding members of Interplay? Well, as far as I'm aware, most of them would go on to do significant work in the industry. Brian Fargo went on to found In Exile Entertainment, where he sits as the CEO to this day. They even made a game called Hunted the Demon's Forge, which was a direct reference to the very first professional game he worked on, The Demon's Forge. Jay Patel would go on to become a senior programmer at Blizzard in what appears to be 2002, presumably also leaving Interplay when the Titus acquisition happened. He would go on to work on several major titles, though most recently he planted his flag in A44 Games with Flintlock Siege of Dawn. Troy Worrell, of all the founding members, seems to have the least substantial career as far as game development is concerned. After he left Interplay in 2001, he would mostly leave the gaming industry in favor of working in various companies wearing various hats. He's currently a high-ranking executive at a marketing firm. And as for Rebecca Hindman, she left Interplay in 1995, wishing to go back to more small-scale projects. She went on to found a few companies, starting with Logicware. Later she founded Contraband Entertainment, and later Old Skull, resulting in an impressive catalog of work. She would even end up doing work for EA, Ubisoft, and Amazon at various points. Quite the impressive resume. Quite the impressive resume for everyone, so it's good to know that they all landed on their feet. And as for Interplay, well, their story isn't necessarily over, but I feel it might as well be. I can't see them making any substantial waves in the future, so if their story was a novel, it would probably just be 3 chapters of the author typing ... And I feel like the company will continue to exist in its current form until Herve Kane sells the company, retires, or passes away. But I very much doubt that anything will come of it. And that's why I'm confident in saying that while the book of Interplay doesn't have a definitive ending just yet, it's probably safe to stop reading now, because the ending is most definitely not going to be very interesting at this point. It's unfortunate that this massive company would gradually shrink and shrink and shrink until it's basically a shell of its former self, largely existing because the people running it forgot to get rid of it, and it's also unfortunate that the story doesn't really have a particularly interesting ending, but that's how it goes sometimes. So thank you, Interplay. You were a groundbreaker, responsible for some of the most important games ever made, and somehow refused to die. That's all I've got. If you like this video and want to support the channel, you can leave a like, comment telling me what you think, subscribe, and hit the notification icon so you're always up to date on what I'm doing. I've been the King of Snark Style right here on Tactical Bacon Productions, and I will see you next time. Stay crispy, my friends.